welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, this is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am really excited about this chat today because this is a book that I think a lot of people are really going to like. It is going to be a staff pick, I can say, because I'm going to make it a staff pick. And I think that readers are just really going to jive with this one. Please introduce yourself and tell us about the Hitchcock Hotel.
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm Stephanie Wrobel, and The Hitchcock Hotel is my third book. First two were Darling Rose Gold in 2020 and This Might Hurt in 2022. But yeah, The Hitchcock Hotel is my latest. It's a thriller. It's about a Hitchcock fanatic named Alfred Smedel, who opens this Hitchcock-themed hotel in the New England mountains and decides to have these old college friends he hasn't spoken to in well over a decade, has some long simmering grudges and unfinished business with them, and decides to invite them all to his hotel for a weekend together. And obviously, dastardly things ensue.
It was very good, and it went in directions that I was not expecting, which is what one would hope for anything that pays any sort of homage to Alfred Hitchcock. You know, you never really want the answers to be obvious. You want to be kept in suspense. You want to be surprised, and you want to be looking in one direction while other things are happening in another. And this book pulls all of that together with just some really clever references to Hitchcock laced within. So the first thing I really want to know is where the idea for this book came from, and are you yourself a Hitchcock fan? Because one really unique thing about this book is that it has references to just different film studies in Hitchcock specifically throughout the different parts of the book.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a Hitchcock fan, which I hope comes across in the book, but you don't have to be one, I think, to enjoy the book. The references are there for the fellow fans, but I think otherwise you're just kind of like, okay, here comes the next clue. I will say this book was kind of my excuse to dive deeper into his oeuvre. Like I had seen a few of his films, but at this point I'm not going to pretend I've seen all 53, but I probably have seen somewhere between 12 and 15, and I'll continue watching more of them as the years go on. But the more you watch of his work, you really start to notice what his obsessions were, what his motifs were, the imagery he keeps coming back to. And I just found it really fun to play with all of that in the book. And you asked about what the inspiration was. I had observed this trend where a lot of my peers in the suspense genre are paying homage to Agatha Christie. That's become like a really popular, trendy thing to do. And I was kind of thinking about like, who are these other like, certainly not forgotten, but these other giants of like thrillers past. And of course, people borrow from Hitchcock all the time, but I wanted to kind of talk about him in a more explicit way. I mean, his name is literally in the title of the book. So I was actually debating between him and Edgar Allan Poe, who's another author I find fascinating. But in the end, actually, it turned out that Poe is not as well known in the UK, but Hitchcock is known pretty well globally. So my editors really responded to, this idea of the Hitchcock themed hotel.
It is a really interesting prospect, and I found the characters just very compelling in their own way. And if we talk too much about just sort of their backgrounds and why they're there, it would be a little spoilery, but all I'm going to say, which sort of dovetails off of what you had said earlier, is that everybody, Alfred has a axe to grind. And actually Alfred's mother, you find out, was a huge Hitchcock fan, hence his name. And, she went so far as wanting to be one of Hitchcock's blondes, but I believe she was a brunette, right? So she couldn't,
Right.
but she thought about dyeing her hair. But, what we know now, and you do touch upon it a little bit in the book, is that Hitchcock was not that great to his leading ladies. And I am being very nice by saying not that great. regardless, Alfred, who is quite awkward, grew up in almost a household where Alfred Hitchcock was held to pretty much like a godlike standard. And he brought some of that to his college film club, which is where all of these people kind of met. Each of the characters have their own backgrounds and their own history with Alfred himself. Were they all part of the main cast when you started writing this story? Did anybody pop up afterwards, or was anybody sort of scrapped?
So they all, no, they were all there originally. I think I knew it needed to be probably 5 or 6 people, including Alfred, just to kind of have enough personality and chaos going around. But the way that I actually approached it, because I was like, oof, this is gonna, I mean, I think the hardest part of writing books is developing characters from scratch. And I was like, oh my God, like the last book I did 3 point of view characters. Now I'm doing like 6. This is going to be so hard. How am I going to keep them straight and in my mind and in the reader's mind? And what I actually did, I've had this long fascination with the 7 deadly sins. I don't know why. I was raised Catholic. Maybe that, that's built into it. But I was like, what if each one of these characters represents one of the sins, whether it's through their job or their main vice or whatever. And we don't like need to walk through each one, but that really helped kind of cement who they were in my mind before I like really knew them when I was just starting out. And so that was a nice little shortcut that I kind of kept in my back pocket of just like, okay, this is how they're differentiated. This is how this like this negative trait stands out versus somebody else's like kind of major negative trait.
That's a really interesting way of looking at it. And Alfred himself, did you kind of include him in there then?
Yes, it's funny. I should have looked at my notes of who was what, because Alfred like could tick quite a few boxes, to be honest. I think I had him maybe as Wrath. I don't want to give too much away, but obviously when you start out reading the book, you're like, what is this guy's deal? Like he's clearly doesn't go into this weekend with good intentions. So yeah, he was the very first character that I conceived of, and I already kind of knew who he was before the 7 deadly sins thing came to the forefront. So I was more like kind of shoehorning, like, oh, would this apply to him? But he was like so distinct in my mind from all the others, already. He's just like, he's so obsessive, he's voyeuristic, he's awkward, like you said, that he was never somebody that was like needed kind of a one word, like, summary to pin him in place.
And again, that said, there are other things in the book, and you just need to indulge me for a very short amount of time because I was a film theory major in college.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. Did you intentionally add sort of just like that film studies part of it in the book? Like you make references to, and I don't know if this was again intentional, Peeping Tom, which was, I believe, a British horror film that had kind of been sort of compared to Psycho in the past. I wasn't sure if that was intentional.
That was not intentional, but I will take
Look
the
it
credit
up,
for
look
that.
it up. Oh my goodness, you need to look it up. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I definitely will. I mean, I will say like a lot of the sort of interstitials that come from these various essays that have been written, those were initially not their own extracts. They were built into the chapters more. And my editors were like, these, like, you clearly have stuff that you want to say about Hitchcock and his body of work, but these are kind of slowing down the narrative pacing. So what if we actually like separate those and put them in between significant chapters or parts or whatever? So that was where I wasn't a film theory major, but I did take a couple film studies class, and those were like some of my favorite things to write because you really get to just lean into all of that analysis, and it goes beyond just the entertainment value, and you're like, what is this piece of art trying to say? And so without being too heavy-handed, I hope I tried to like squeeze that stuff in there.
You did. And again, like I said, it was just a lot of fun. And I really do think, and I'm glad that you said you don't have to be a Hitchcock fan to enjoy the book. I do think this is going to hit just the right nerve with a lot of people because while all of the characters are unlikable in their own way, there's also things that I did like about them. They're not great people, but they're very interesting people. And it was very fascinating to see them together in this gimmicky environment. And, for Alfred, again, it's almost like this shrine to his life, to what he was brought up with, and to his own standards. And it was the thing that kind of brought them together in their own ways, even though everybody in this group was very different. But aside from that, it's also just like these characters interacting, and then everything kind of takes a different direction, and you really just do not know where it's going. And that is what I loved about it. I think that people are just going to read this book and they're going to have so much fun with the ride that maybe they'll go back and they'll want to actually study some or watch some Hitchcock in and of itself, because it is so good.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean it's tricky when you're writing thrillers as far as characters and unlikability goes, unless you're writing more of a classic procedural where your protagonist is the cop or the journalist who is, they're generally good people. The kinds of books that I like to write, usually the people doing wrong are my narrators. So it's always tricky, I don't think it's giving too much away to say that there is a dead body that comes at some point in the book, and everybody in the book is a suspect. And so for that to be believable, you can't really have too many people that are, pure hearts of gold. And not to mention, I don't think in real life that there's that many people who are all good. That we're all a mix of our best and worst days, and hopefully there's more good days than bad days. But yeah, that's always tricky because, of course, a lot of readers get frustrated. They want somebody they can root for and get behind. But yeah, when you're doing like a murder mystery situation, you've kind of got to give enough plausible suspects. So it's still, a surprise when the end turns out the way that it does.
Definitely. Did you see that end coming? Like, are you a very big planner, or did it creep up on you?
So there's a big twist that happens halfway through, and that I always knew from the very beginning was going to happen. I knew who it would happen to. I knew it would happen at the halfway point. I was actually modeling after one of Hitchcock's films when I made that decision. But that said, I did not know how the book was going to end till, I don't know, probably a little more than halfway through the draft. I knew that I had this mystery that needed to wrap up, but I didn't know how, and that was okay with me. I think the halfway point twist was more of an important anchoring, because then from there it was just like, okay, well, when things happen, like the tires are and the cars are slashed, somebody's like poisoned repeatedly, all of it, like somebody's intruded on in the shower. Like I knew all of these like creepy things were going to be happening, but I didn't know who was going to be doing any of them. So that was actually kind of a fun little. I've never written a mystery before, or like, who done it. I will say that is quite the mental workout, just trying to hold all those puzzle pieces in place. It's a lot more than just like creepy vibes, which is kind of a lot what my last two books are. And it was a mental sweat for sure, but it was a lot of fun.
So that said, for those of us who are curious, what are your favorite Hitchcock movies?
So Rope is one of my favorites. It's one of his shorter ones. It's about this isn't spoiling anything. In the first couple minutes, these two college friends decide to murder one of their old friends, and then they put his body in a trunk and proceed to have a dinner party and basically spend 90 minutes being, well, one of them is very stressed that they're going to be found out, and the other one has kind of more sociopathic tendencies and is less nervous. And what I find so amazing about that film is exactly what has happened. There's not like a ton of surprises left other than like, will they be caught or won't they? And yet I was on the edge of my seat for the entire 90 minutes. Like I was so stressed. And it goes to show, I won't belabor the whole surprise versus suspense thing with Hitchcock, but it really does go to show when you give the audience more information than the characters have, there's a certain level of suspense and stress that you can put on a reader or a viewer. And so I think that's just one. His other movies obviously are incredible too, but I feel like that's one that unless you're a film fan, you might not know as well, versus like, of course, Psycho and Stranger on a Train and, To Catch a Thief, Dial M for Murder. Like these are all, there's stuff to be learned from all of them. But I will say, I think Rope and Psycho are probably the two that I leaned on the most heavily in crafting this book.
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, Alfred in general is a very clear nod to Norman Bates in a few ways. And it was fun to read that. That is a very interesting movie.
Mm.
Personally, I am a huge fan of Vertigo.
Of course, yeah.
Atmospherically, especially, although I will say, when I try to describe that movie and they're like, just tell me what happens, it sounds really ridiculous. Like if I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, and like over 50-year-old spoiler for the movie, I'm not going to spoil it for whoever's listening to this, because you should watch Vertigo. Put aside 3 hours of your life to watch Vertigo. But it is one of those movies that I feel like, unless you're watching it, if you're trying to describe to people what it's about and like you're telling them how it ends and what the twists are, you kind of sit back and you're just like, yeah, I don't know how I suspended my disbelief for that. This is a little out there, but it is still such a fun ride, and a lot of it is just the shots and the city of San Francisco and the music, and I think that that's kind of one of those things that draws it all together.
Yeah, I will say, I think audiences now are much more concerned with plausibility than they were in Hitchcock's era. And I even have a quote in the book, Hitchcock he kind of poo-pooed plausibility. He's like, okay, you call the cops and like the story's over. What fun is that? He's like, I want to deliver a fun experience. And I kind of appreciate that, because so much of like writing a book now is like, okay, like how can I throw them off my tracks? But like this has to be believable enough. And you know what I mean? Like you can get very mired down in logistics. And so I do think, but to your point specifically about Vertigo, yeah, I mean, it can sound patently ridiculous, but also I think Obsession kind of does, unless you're watching it unfold, right? It's James Stewart like slowly morphing into this like monstrous guy that,
Yeah.
and of course Kim Novak, that it just like makes the ridiculous seem possible. Maybe not plausible, but at least possible, which is really all you need. You just need that little like shimmer of possibility.
Yeah, and I just kind of, to your other point, because I've spoken to a bunch of authors about this, that having cell phones and
Hmm.
that's all I'm going to say about the cell phones right now. A lot of authors have said that setting a book during a time with cell phones is very difficult if it is a suspense or a horror, because it like I will sit and I'll watch something like the old Buffy the Vampire Slayer, or even Goonies, and I'll be like, yeah, if there were cell phones, this would be over in 5 minutes,
Yeah.
like that's it. And again, not to veer too far off of it, in the late, I guess it was the late 90s, you saw things like Scream, which was able to use that technology to build suspense, but it's very, very difficult in a connected world. And the fact that you were able to make a modern story that really drew in the feeling of a Hitchcockian suspense is just sort of a testament to just how much fun it is and how well you did with it. Yeah, this is going to be a big hit with audiences. It is due out in September.
Yes. And thank you for saying that. Yeah, I think that's why, regarding sort of the interconnectedness between cell phones and the internet, I think that's why you find so many thrillers now are either set in remote locations where there's no Wi-Fi, or like cell phones have to somehow come out of the equation very early on. And it's become this sort of trope, I'm in the new book that I'm working on, I sort of poke fun at that. But it's true. Like it's good for us in real life and our safety, but it's terrible for suspense when you need to keep putting conflict in your characters' ways, because yeah, anyone could just pull out a phone and like 911 is there in 30 seconds. So yeah, I mean the way that I do it in the book is, there was this, Alfred sort of leans on this excuse of like his old professor used to always collect the phones in the baskets before they would do film screenings in college. And you could see that, at least when I was in college, 2008, 2009, whatever, that being maybe a possibility. I don't know if it's even realistic anymore, but like there's also a different level of reliance on phones now. So it's always a tricky conundrum trying to figure that little question out.
So you are working on something new as we speak then?
Yes. So I'm about halfway into a first draft. I don't have a pitch down for it yet, so really can't say much about it, but it's another suspense novel, and this one will only be 2 points of view. So I I am, at least for now, hanging up the whatever, my crack at doing so many POVs, because Hitchcock definitely gave me a run for my money.
Yeah, that must have been extremely difficult for you, because I believe in the last book we spoke about, because I do not believe we were able to connect for your first book, there were 2 POVs. How difficult was it for you to sort of fit everybody into the puzzle here? Did you find yourself kind of going a little crazy or a little mad, pun intended, putting together the continuity between the different characters?
So I was less worried about my own ability to keep the characters straight and more worried about the reader's ability, because I know that's a really common complaint with books with that many POVs, is just like, I have no idea what's going on. So my strategy was to kind of space out the introduction of new voices. So in the first third of the book, I think it's only Alfred, Samira. Oh God, no, I'm already forgetting who else is in the book. Alfred, Samira, and Zoe are at the beginning. And then slowly, like, TJ comes in, and then Julius, and like Grace at the end. And so my hope is that you start, by getting kind of acclimated to these few characters and introducing them one at a time, versus just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in the first 6 chapters. Like, I'm hoping that helps differentiate them more in readers' minds.
This was super fun. Thank you so much for chatting with us about it.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So once again, this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. Our guest was
Stephanie Wrobel.
And we are going to close this chapter.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.